Good morning, everybody online, and good morning here in our conference room. It is time now to introduce the first keynote for the day. It is Professor Paulo Coluzzi, a PhD from the University of Bristol. Paulo was born in Milan. He's an Italian and worked at the University of Brunei before coming to Malaysia 12 years ago, where he now works as an associate professor at the University Malaya in Kuala Lumpur. His research interests are endangered languages, language planning, the linguistic landscape, new speakerhood, and nationalism. Lately, his research interests have included the practical applications of Toki Pona and other constructed languages. He has published articles in edited books and on several international peer-reviewed journals. His book, Minority Language Planning and Micronationalism in Italy, an analysis of the situation of Friulan, Cimbrian, and Western Lombard with reference to Spanish minority language, Oxford Peter Lang, was published in 2007. Paulo Coluzzi is an author that Susanna, who is chairing today, and I use in one of our courses when we discuss Italian minorities, actually in more than just one course. Paulo, are you there?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes,
the word to you.
Yeah. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon here in Malaysia. It's 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm so sorry I'm not there. I could perhaps travel there, but then it would have been difficult to come back with the quarantine and etc. So here I am online, unfortunately. Anyway, let me share the screen and let's start. As I have quite a lot to say, let's move this here. Okay. Okay. All right. I hope hold on. I want to get rid of this. I can. Okay. All right. So let me start. This is the title of my presentation. Small languages in the world are disappearing at an alarming pace, and in most cases, very little or nothing is being done to prevent this. And even when some form of language revitalization or language planning is carried out, it seems as if the successful cases are not many. Of course, we sociolinguists know the main reason: the prestige and usefulness of the big languages, whether they are national or international languages like English. However, even when good language planning tries to raise the status and usefulness of the local languages, the results are not always satisfactory. Sorry. The problem, in my view, lies in the various ideologies that dominate our society. I believe that if these ideologies are not tackled, no matter how difficult this may be, the chances of success will be limited. Most of what has been studied and written so far, or language ideologies, has focused on the standard language ideology. That is, how the idea of standard applied to languages has influenced the way we look at them. As a matter of fact, this ideology is pivotal and has been included among the ideologies influencing minority language revitalization. Another important ideology that has been the focus of much academic research is that of nationalism, whether state nationalism or micronationalism, or ethnic nationalism or micronationalism, as I call them. All these ideologies discussed here influence the way we look at languages and the way to protect and preserve them, minority and regional languages, and many aspects related to them. Some of them might be seen as minor ideologies vis-a-vis the ideologies of standard language and nationalism, but they are nonetheless very important and influential for the way language planning for minority and regional languages has been framed and carried out so far. I wanted to clarify here that calling them ideologies does not exclude their usefulness in some situations. They are ideology in as much as people believe they are truisms, just because most people accept them. Okay, what are these ideologies? I can think of at least 9 of them. Some are more common among the general public and the public institutions that exert a strong influence on it, others among academics, still others among activists, and some are shared among these groups. Obviously, this does not mean that everybody are influenced by these ideologies in the same way or to the same degree. Okay, as for the general public and public institutions, the main ideologies or myths are the following, in my view, of course. The ideology of modernity or new, the ideology of new, the ideology of standard, the ideology of monolingualism, the ideology of purism, the ideology of nationalism, specifically macro-nationalism, and the myth of dialect fragmentation. As for academia, particularly linguists, one can find the following: the ideology of nationalism and the myth of academic neutrality and objectivity. With regards to activists, common ideologies or myths are the ideology of standard, the ideology of purism, the ideology of monographism, as I call it, the ideology of micro-nationalism, and the myth that having a small group of very active and committed activists may be enough to stop or slow down language shift. After a short introduction to the linguistic situation in Italy, all these ideologies, myths, will be looked at. Examples will be drawn from my own research and experience, with a special focus on one of Italy's regional languages, in Italy normally referred to as dialects, Lombard, and on one officially recognized minority language, Cimbrian, whereby the negative influence of all these ideologies seems to be particularly evident. So Lombard, just briefly, Lombard, for those who don't know, is, as I was saying, I would call it regional language spoken in the northern Italy, in the Lombardy region, but also in some areas just outside it, in Piedmont and Trentino, and in Switzerland as well, in Canton Ticino and some valleys in Canton Ticino. There are, difficult to say, but perhaps around 3.5 million speakers. Lombard is, by the way, is a Gallo-Italic variety, which means that it's structurally closer to French languages from France than to Italian, standard Italian. On the other hand, Cimbrian is diasporic. The Cimbrians are a diasporic community because apparently, according to studies on their language, they came from Bavaria and Western Tyrol around, they started, I mean, their immigration to what is called now Italy started around 1,000 years ago. The language they speak retains many features of old Middle High German. Few speakers are left, fluent speakers, definitely less than 300. If the ideologies, myths listed above are not tackled and deconstructed, the purpose of language planning is unlikely to be realized. Considering the limited resources that most minority groups have access to, this may prove to be quite a difficult task. Leaving these ideologies undisturbed, though, will make most strategies of reversing language shift and not very effective and even hopeless endeavor. I'm going to start with this ideology, the ideology of modernity, as I believe it is extremely important for the way we look at languages, both big and small. What I have defined as ideology of modernity, new, is actually much more than a mere language ideology. But in my view, it does influence the way people look at and evaluate languages as much as other ideologies. The ideology of modernity simply states that anything, or at least most things, new or modern, are better than older things. Whether the old item replaced by the new was actually better, or at least as functional as the new one, is not really taken into consideration. Examples of this are, for example, fashion with new clothes or hairstyles that have to change every year, or pop music, and so on and so forth. This obviously suits the current neoliberal economic system that hinges on the creation of new desires that people are expected to continuously fulfill, with the terrible consequences that the continuous discarding of all the items have on the environment. And this idea of new is better, if applied to languages as well, leads inevitably to the idea that standard official languages, and particularly English, are better because they are modern, vis-a-vis dialects and minority languages that are seen as useless because they are old. There is normally little or no evaluation of the advantages and disadvantages of the maintenance and spread or not of one or the other. And often even the possibility of keeping both the new and the old, the national language, English, and the local language, is perceived as a waste of time and resources. According to, let's move on, according to this ideology of standard, what is uniform, stable, and widespread is seen as inherently good. The primary definition of standardization is taken to be the imposition of uniformity upon a class of objects. Until a couple of centuries ago, the concepts of standard hardly existed, as there was no real need for this kind of uniformity. Taking measurement system as an example, every place had their own local measures for weighing solids and liquids, for distances, etc. There was a lot of diversity, but that was not a problem because mobility was very limited, and most of the people were born, lived, and died in the same place. It was particularly starting from the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century and the subsequent increase in people's traveling and displacement for trade or for work that the need for a standard measurement system started to become a necessity, as, particularly for trade, many different measures were confusing and impractical. A couple of centuries later, most countries now use only one system of measurement for the whole territory, and this system is now nearly everywhere the decimal metrical system. In line with the previous definition, this standard language ideology too requires uniformity and invariance. The idea is that the languages that have been standardized, mostly the big languages in the world, are real languages, or even better languages we have to look up to as models. The non-standardized or under-standardized languages, on the other hand, do not even deserve to be called languages, and are in fact often termed dialects. And the term dialect generally carries rather negative connotations as a substandard, low status, often rustic form of a language, generally associated with the peasantry, the working class, or other groups lacking in prestige. The artificiality of the standardization problem is totally disregarded. That is, the fact that standard languages are not the result of a natural process, but of decisions taken by some elite groups. Only a few languages had gone through the process of standardization before the invention of the printing press, which could not afford having to deal with too much language variation. The printing press are around 15th century. It has been from the time of the Industrial Revolution and the mobility and needs for fast and easy communication that followed it, that the idea of a standard language has become more pervasive, coupled with the ideology of nationalism on one side and romantic ideas such as those of Johann Gottfried Herder on the other. Standard languages seem to have helped economic development and the spread of literacy, but they have also led to the marginalization and demise of all the other languages present in the same territory, where a standard language has a strong presence or is the official language. The widespread ideas of what is correct or not in a language, or even what is beautiful or not, which languages can be discarded and which retained, come from this very ideology. But let's move on. The ideology of nationalism, one country, one people, one language, is perhaps the shortest possible definition of nationalism. Within certain ethnic boundaries lives a particular ethnicity, sometimes called nation, whose main characteristic is normally the use of a particular language or related language varieties, at least in the case of micro-nationalism. As with large states, where different ethnicity or regional groups may be found, the case is different. Macro-nationalism, in fact, aims at leveling out differences within the state normally by imposing one language on all its citizens, which may not be related at all with some of the small languages spoken by some of them. The difference between micro-nationalism and macro-nationalism is very important as far as the attitudes towards the language varieties present on the territory and the status are concerned. The basic idea of one country or autonomous region, one people, one language is, however, similar. The idea of a prestigious standard language that everybody should learn is there, with the difference that in small nations or autonomous regions, the standard chosen is normally closer to the languages spoken by the people and may not have the same status and prestige as stronger standard languages known by the people, such as the former external or internal colonial languages and/or English. In any case, the idea of nationalism is also quite recent, having developed in the 18th century. Before that, states did exist, but the idea of uniformity was not really there. Which languages the common people spoke was not of great concern for the authorities. Normally, loyalty to a state was expressed not through the knowledge of one specific language, but through adhering to the same religion and accepting the authority of a monarch or another leading figure. The ideology of nationalism here is very close to the ideology of standard language outlined above. I refer to the belief that the national standard language is the best variety and the model to look up to, whereas any other language variety is secondary and may be abandoned. Generally speaking, this idea of one nation, one language is much stronger in a large macro nation, such as Italy, for example, where minority and regional languages may be not tolerated or at least sidelined. Even though some micronations may follow the same pattern and be quite close towards general linguistic diversity, others are much more open and tolerant towards it. The ideology of purism, in the same way as the ideologies of modernity, of standard and of nationalism, doesn't apply only to languages. The basic idea of this ideology is that pure, not mixed languages, as well as ethnic groups and cultures, among other things, do exist, and they are better, superior than those that have come into contact and mixed with other languages, ethnic groups, cultures. If the language in question is not considered pure enough, it is believed that it can be made so by careful planning. Most purist efforts can be seen as xenophobic, as they try to avoid foreign elements and to use native ones. The idea behind the ideology of monolingualism is that for practical and symbolical reasons, within one country, one language is enough, with English added for international relations or education. Multilingualism is seen as divisive, anti-patriotic, and a waste of resources, particularly when it includes local minority and regional languages. Often, when a writing system is devised by experts or activists for a language that did not have one, some other individuals or groups within the local community or even the academic community may come up with alternative orthographies. We have just seen an example, which are considered better. That is more precise, authentic, inclusive, or simply more peculiar and distinct from the majority language in the country. For the same language, many writing systems are of course possible, some deeper, some shallower, some using the Latin script, others using other scripts. It largely depends on the purposes or cultural orientation of the proposals, and any of these systems have advantages and disadvantages. The problem is that sometimes the minority committee gets divided over this issue of graphization, and long and even harsh diatribes have arisen. The problem with this ideology is that it is an either-or ideology. It is normally the orthography that gets official support that wins out. The alternative orthographies, however, may be around for a long time, together with resentment and division, which is not good for language revitalization. Okay, now let's talk about this myth. The main difference, first of all, the main difference between ideologies and myths seem to be the lack or the marginality of moral and political interests in the case of myths. Also, myths seem to refer to things that do not actually exist, whereas the object of an ideology is real, the problem being the way we look at and interpret it. And another important difference is that it is normally non-linguists and often public institutions, media, etc., that hold the language myths. However, there are cases when even linguists and activists may hold myths that can obstruct language planning efforts. In relation to minority and regional languages, the myth of academic neutrality and objectivity, which is very powerful among many academics, basically states, I'm a scientist, what I say is based on solid scientific research and is therefore true. There may be other linguists saying exactly the opposite, but they are disregarded and probably considered simply bad linguists. So if a linguist says, this is not a language, it's a dialect, or dialect should not be taught in school, many people may take this as truisms and accept that. Okay, another myth is that of dialect fragmentation. Many, including speakers themselves, believe that the dialects spoken even in neighboring villages are too different to be lumped together and considered part of the same language. This is partly a sign of strong local identities, but it's also a myth that can greatly hinder minority language planning and disperse the minimal resources available. As a matter of fact, the big differences claimed are normally just a matter of some slightly different phonological and morphological traits and a few lexical items. Even though all linguists would disregard the small differences, sociolinguists especially, they may insist that larger divisions in classification should be maintained even against some speakers and activists' claims. Okay, this is another myth we're going to talk about. This may sound like a very minor issue, but I've seen that sometimes wider and more effective efforts to preserve a language are not carried out because of this myth that having a small group of very active and committed activists may be enough to stop or slow down language shift. Activists may feel their initiatives are being successful among the small circle of people surrounding them interested in the local language. Being surrounded by sympathetic and enthusiastic people that follow most of their initiatives make them lose sight of the predicament the language finds itself in, or the fact that the vast majority of the people outside the small circle simply don't know it and don't have any facilities or incentives to learn it. Okay, how have these ideologies affected the maintenance and revitalization of minority and regional languages in Italy? I'm going now to discuss the ways the ideologies outlined above have affected and slowed down language planning to revitalize minorities and regional languages in Italy. We will look at how these ideologies have influenced the attitudes of the three main social groups outlined above towards minority and regional languages in Italy, and specifically towards Lombard and Simple, which have been part of my research. We will look at the language ideologies I see as held by the general public and public institutions first, then those of academia, and finally, the ideologies held by many activists. Okay, beginning with the ideology of modernity, new, all minority and regional languages are seen by most non-linguists as belonging to the past and therefore not very relevant to modern life. As testimonies of the past, it may be fine to retain them in a folkloric and museum-like way, but not as living languages. As most minority and regional languages, including Lombard and Cimbrian, are not standardized and present considerable internal variation, they're not really considered proper languages. As a matter of fact, Lombard, in the same way as all Italian regional languages, is normally considered a mere dialect or group of dialects, with all this involves in terms of maintenance and revitalization. For efficiency and unity, Italians need to master Italian. This is the idea of monolingualism. For efficiency and unity, Italians need to master Italian only in a version that should be the closest possible to standard Italian. Apart from standard Italian, English can be learned, of course, for communication with the outside world or for education. Even regional varieties of Italian with their distinct vocabulary and accents are often frowned upon following this ideology of purism. This attitude falls into the ideology of purism as well, as these regional varieties are seen as mixed and impure in the same way as dialects and minority languages, where code switching and mixing are very common among native speakers. The ideology of monolingualism here is clearly part of the more encompassing ideology of nationalism, where the national language occupies a central position, and according to which minorities and regional languages are a threat to national unity. The latter should be left to disappear slowly, while regional identity may be allowed to be expressed through things like folk dances and costume, cuisine, etc. The myth of dialect fragmentation is holding up any attempts made at revitalizing the local language as a whole. For some people, revitalizing Milanese, Bergamasco, or Cremonese separately is fine, but no attempt should be made to revitalize Lombard with its varieties, of course. Even in the Cimbrian area, hardly any attempts have been made to carry out at least some aspects of language planning together. This may not be a problem in itself, but it does not help the status and prestige of the local languages. It is a waste of the scarce resources available. The linguist and activist Lysander Brasca, for example, has devised a writing system that could be used for all Lombard varieties. Some reject it, as it is not believed that one unitary orthography could or should be used for such different dialects. The strongest ideology affecting most Italian linguists' attitude, now I'm going to talk about linguistic ideologies and myths held by academia. The strong ideology affecting most Italian linguists' attitudes towards minority and regional languages is the ideology of nationalism. Among many Italian linguists, there seems to be a fear that revitalizing minority and especially regional languages and giving them the opportunity to share some high functions with Italian may lead to separatism and the eventual breakup of the Italian nation. As for the recognized minority languages like Cimbrian, the attitude is again rather folkloric and museum-like. The general justification is that there is no use for minority language planning. Dialects, as they insist calling regional languages, are healthy enough, disregarding all the clear signs and data showing the slow demise of all Italian regional language. As linguists, since they cannot really justify the use of the term dialect for autonomous varieties, some of which belong to Western Romance, such as Lombard, the Italian coming from the Florentine variety belongs to the Eastern Romance, they have come up with a distinction between primary and secondary dialects and classify all Italian regional language into the first. What linguists say, okay, going back to the myth of academic neutrality and objectivity, what linguists say is scientific and therefore true, including about the use of the term dialect for regional languages, or that the Lombard language does not exist, which has been affirmed, that it is only a group of different, even though related dialects. These statements, especially when they are reported on national newspapers, do influence public's opinion and attitudes. Okay, now let's look at language ideologies held by activists. The ideology of the standard language seems to have percolated down to the varieties activists try to protect. Some of them envisage a standard for the minority of regional language that should supersede all varieties and should be the model to follow, creating in this way an opposition between correct and incorrect local languages and running the risk of marginalizing the native speaker of the non-standard varieties. This is an ideology, however, that has not affected Lombard or Cimbrian yet, even though a few have looked at the Milanese variety as a possible candidate. I think most Lombard activists would rather favor small standard for each of the main Lombard varieties, which could lead to fragmentation. Some activists also tend towards purism, in the sense that they think the local language should reject loans or any influence from Italian and should only use the older traditional vocabulary, and new words should be created based on the roots of the language. This will help to keep the minority language clearly distinct from the official state language, of course, but it could also marginalize native speakers who naturally use a lot of loan words. As I mentioned above, even the frequent code switching and mixing with Italian among the native speaker is often considered a problem to be avoided. In reference to Lombard, and more specifically to its Milanese variety, Some reject the dictionaries compiled by experts related to the historic Circolo Filologico Milanese because they consider many of the terms chosen to be too close to Italian. Some activists see the language they are protecting as a symbol of the autonomy and distinctiveness of the people speaking it, and they may envisage an autonomous region or even a separate state where the local language would become the official language. Even though this in itself is not a problem, it could easily be seen as perhaps the best way to protect the language. On the other hand, it may scare off potential speakers who are not autonomists or separatists and see the language more as a cultural resource. Another problem is that some of these activists look down on Italian as a sort of colonial language that should be avoided, in a way rejecting multilingualism. Another ideology that has, in my view, been very problematic, has negatively affected many minority language planning efforts, is what I call the ideology of monographism. As explained above, often more than one writing system is available. I'll just move on because I think there is not much time left. As far as Simbrian is concerned, each Simbrian village uses an orthography that is slightly different from the others. In Lombardy, each main variety is written using more than a single writing system, even though one of the orthography normally prevails. For Western Lombard, and more specifically Milanese, three main orthographic systems are currently being used. One is the classic system, another is the modern system that's also used in Canton Ticino in Switzerland, and the third one is the system known as Scribe Lombard, mentioned above. Whereas the modern system is the most phonetic and uses some diacritics and graphics common in German, the classic system, the most common one at the moment, looks more French. And even though it is largely phonetic, it has some etymological features. In short, these two systems are rather shallow and easy to read for those who don't know or are learning the language. On the other hand, Scribe Lombard, which has been developed to be used for all Lombard varieties, is necessarily more etymological and therefore deeper. Now, there are differing opinions on the merits of one or another of these orthographies, but the idea is that in the end, only one should be adopted. This is, I believe, an aspect of our dualistic Western culture that fails to realize that adopting more than one system may be the best solution to prevent divisions within a small group of activists. Okay, I've also noted this myth among some activists for Lombard. I think I talked about that before, so I think I'm over my time. So we can skip that, but you can read all that in the book. The solution to all this, overcoming and deconstructing all these ideologies may prove very difficult, as they are deeply ingrained in the general culture and often backed by powerful public institutions and the media. Perhaps only in two of these cases, the solution may be at hand, but not carried out for different reasons. I'm referring to the ideology of modernity and that of monographism. To tackle the ideology of modernity, the best strategies, in my view, would be to create products and facilities in the local language that present a sleek and modern look or sound. Okay, I'll just move on quickly. Again, you can read all this article. I would like just to finish to talking briefly about this ideology of monographism. As far as this ideology is concerned, frictions and disagreements within the community could be simply avoided by accepting a regime of digraphia with 2 or 3 orthographic systems used for the same language. After all, other languages in the world do use more than one graphic system. If one system is shallower and one deeper, like in the Lombard case, the shallower system could help new speakers to learn the local language, as the written form would be closer to pronunciation, whereas the deeper system would allow everybody to enjoy wider written communication with all the Lombard speakers in the region. As far as all other ideologies and myths described are concerned, the only solution, in my view, is information and education. People, especially young people, should be taught to think critically, to question everything. All ideologies are human constructions, often created for the benefit of the ruling classes, and better information should help people realize this. Deconstructing all the ideologies discussed here might prove impossible, but I believe it should at least be attempted, as not doing so will just accelerate language shift and lead to the demise of all small languages in Italy and in the world. Thank you.